Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend.
Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we talk about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, I'm here with Liz Fong-Jones, who is a developer advocate, labor and ethics organizer, and site reliability engineer with over 18 years of experience. She's currently the field CTO at Honeycomb. Previously was an SRE working on products ranging from the Google Cloud Load Balancer to Google Flights. How are you, Liz?
I'm doing good.
Anything I missed from my intro that you wanted to tell people about yourself?
Not in particular. I think, I've been around the SRE community for many, many years. Kind of a career SRE turned advocate for SREs, but I still partake in on-call every now and then. I actually was working an incident on Sunday, a couple days before we recorded this episode. So,
really?
So my fingers in the pie.
That's cool. And do you think that, well, we're about to talk about developer advocacy and what that's all about, but do you think that having that, continuing to do some hands-on work feeds into your work?
I think it's really essential because otherwise you wind up in this ivory tower, right? Where you're, saying all these things about how, you're supposed to do SRE and it turns out, right, they're not real or people haven't actually done that for 3 or 4 years, right? So I find it helps me get empathy for what people who are working the SRE job role are going through and how I can best help them.
So I guess to start things off, today we're talking about developer advocacy. I've heard the term DevRel as well. I think they're the same thing. Are they the same thing?
No, they're not. So developer relations is the broader practice of how you as a business relate to your developer community. And developer advocates are specifically people who typically come from an engineering background, who are the people who are kind of building out those specific kind of use cases, delivering product feedback, who are kind of closing that loop with the engineering and R&D and sales organizations. But there's this whole constellation of other roles that can fall under developer relations. Everything from community roles to get customers talking to each other and kind of customer marketing, as it were, can fall under developer relations. And also documentation can fall under developer relations as well, right? Like when you see documentation that you're really raving about, that's a sign that someone has put in their developer relations work.
Just to draw into that a bit, so developer advocacy specifically, what kinds of things does a developer advocate? I mean, technically my role is developer advocate as well. So what does a developer advocate do from your perspective?
So from my perspective, a developer advocate is responsible for starting credible conversations with the community, right? Where you go on stage sometimes and the goal is not to talk at people. The goal is to start enough of a conversation to kind of seed those ideas out there and to see how people respond, right? And to really bring that feedback back into the company that you're working for. And that kind of helps you achieve alignment with the market in terms of both, preparing the market to think the way that your company thinks, as well as if the company is misaligned, making sure that you are adjusting, right? So I think that is the kind of crucial function, right? When we talk about, yes, DevRels go out on stage, right? You think DevRels, the job is glamorous. We get to go out speaking and traveling the world. Except for number one, that's not the entirety of the job. And number two, sure, we see the world, but we see the inside of conference halls, right? Yeah. It's not like we get to do much touristing when we're out and about. And, right, I think the other piece is the crucial bit of translating that customer feedback into action, right? Making sure that we are not just speaking, but we're producing the right developer content, that we are responding to complaints from users. Obviously, we're not a replacement for customer success or customer support, but I think kind of those broad strokes trends of what are the disparate areas that people are struggling with still, and how can we potentially address them?
Okay, when you're going to do a talk or present something or put an idea out there, do you come up with the thing that you're going to talk about yourself, or does it come from our company has a particular idea, we think this is where the market's at or what's going on, we want to validate that, and then they ask you to go and present it?
It's kind of a mixture, and I think it depends upon the seniority of the DevRel. Certainly more junior DevRels will wind up kind of either pre-announcing or, just after, a feature has come out, talking about how to best use that feature. But the thing about that is that's rather vendor specific, and most kind of, unless you work at a very large company that already has a developer community around it, for instance, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, right? Like where you can, speak at the Google Cloud meetup in your local town about how to use a Google Cloud feature, right? Most of the time, if you're speaking at a vendor neutral conference, they don't want to hear about, your company's product. They want to hear about your company's ideas, right? How those company's ideas are generally applicable. So I think as you get more senior, it's not necessarily product specific and is more shifting people's perspectives or kind of giving people best practices for kind of how to work in the industry at large. And when that intersects with a company's roadmap, right? Like I certainly, I think 6 months or 12 months ahead of us releasing some features with regards to tail sampling and kind of data volume management, I was out talking about the philosophy of sampling, right? But as a kind of general approach, rather than, my company's about to announce thing X, right? Instead of it was a here's why you should consider that maybe keeping 100% of your data is bad, right? Here's some techniques that like allow you to have confidence in the data, and kind of got that, getting the instinctual pushback of I want 100% of my data, right? Like out of the way. So does that make sense, right? Like it's kind of this mixture of you're invited to speak about certain subjects, right? That you're known for. And also the company can influence that in some ways, but if it influences it too much, you lose your credibility, right? Yeah. I think that's important to emphasize. As a developer relations professional, you are lending your company your credibility. So you better not, lend your company your credibility and have it come back damaged, right? You have to protect against that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because I've been in situations where there's a particular idea or point of view that the company has, and I don't necessarily know whether I'm fully behind that, and I find it very hard to create content about that or to speak about it unless I completely am behind it. Have you had a better situation where you've kind of been asked to present or write about something and you just it feels a little bit manufactured?
I can certainly say that I have had, fairly deep skepticism that's, fairly deeply rooted about, hey, maybe crypto and Web3 stuff is not good for the planet. Maybe it's not accomplishing good things, right? Like if Honeycomb were to ask me to produce content about, here's how to use Honeycomb for Web3, I would be like, number one, maybe I'm not the best messenger for this because I've blown my credibility with that community, right? And then number two, here are my own ethical considerations. But really, if they insisted, right? I might explain how yes, you could use Honeycomb for this workload, but I'm not suggesting that you go and do it for the sake of of implementing this exercise, right? If you're already using it, fine. Here's how to do it, right? So there's kind of this delicate balance of recognizing when are you not necessarily going to be super effective, even if you were pushed to do it, right?
Yeah. So you were working as an SRE at Google, and at some point you got involved in developer advocacy. How did that happen?
Yeah, this is a story that I tell every single time someone asks me about the difference between sponsorship and mentorship. So I've had, a great many mentors over the years, but Sabrina Farmer, who is now a vice president of SRE at Google, or I think she might have recently changed out of SRE at Google, but anyways, at the time she was a director of SRE at Google, and she was one of the co-chairs of SRECon, the kind of long-standing Usenix conference that is a global conference for SREs to get together, across the industry, regardless of what company they work for. So Sabrina was stepping down from her role as one of the SRECon program committee co-chairs. And I'd never spoken to a conference before, ever, external to Google. But I'd worked on something like 10 different teams at Google in my many years at Google. And Sabrina said, you've never done this before, but Liz, you've seen a lot of stuff at Google. You have a really valuable perspective that not many people at Google have, because a lot of people just tend to stay heads down on one specific team. And also I was known for giving talks within Google. So Sabrina basically came to me and said, do you want to co-chair SRECon? I want to recommend you for this. It'll be a stretch. It'll be a career growth for you, right? That was not mentorship, right? We didn't have, regular one-on-ones. That was kind of her sponsoring me for that role, knowing that would be good for my career and it would be a good stretch for me, right? So I did it, and I really loved it. I loved sharing knowledge with the community, kind of helping cultivate those conversations. And what I came to realize is that, sure, I was acting as the line manager of one specific team at Google, the Cloud Bigtable team. And I had 8 direct reports. Sure, I could grow my empire, as it were, and, have 12 direct reports, 15 direct reports, start having indirect reports. But at the end of the day, like, my impact from doing that was going to be finite, right? It was going to just be the set of people in my direct org chain. And I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do, right? That I had a passion for broader SRE education and kind of getting the industry on the same page about what SRE means, how do we up-level each other, how do we communicate with each other about what we're doing. So I kind of really wanted to lean into that SRE work. And it so happened that Google Cloud was viewing SRE as a differentiation point, and that Google Cloud wanted to hire people full-time to work on instilling SRE culture in Google Cloud's customers. So I had the opportunity to switch on to the New York customer reliability engineering team. There were CREs in London and San Francisco's Mountain View at the time that I joined that team, but I was one of the first New York-based customer reliability engineers. So I did a fair bit of kind of hands-on work with customers, kind of pairing one-on-one with customers to establish SRE cultures at their companies. And then over time, what I realized is that it might actually make even better sense for me to shift, outside of the SRE org chart entirely and into DevRel full-time, because I had basically stopped working on SRE tooling at that point, and I was working primarily on SRE education efforts, and the DevRel job ladder was just much better aligned with the outcomes that I wanted to push. So that's how I got into DevRel. I still have DevRel as part of my job responsibilities, but technically I'm not a DevRel anymore. I'm a field CTO. So kind of going back to those roots of working one-on-one with customers to really help them get the most out of what they're doing with observability.
So at Google, was there sort of a defined DevRel career path that was there?
Yes, very much. And that's kind of really why I wanted to pursue that, was the customer reliability engineering efforts were an experiment. We were trying to see, can we promote and reward people for doing kind of one-on-one reliability work with customers, right? So kind of still having deep hands-on engineering contributions to, Google's own systems or customer systems. But at the end of the day, we were still on the SRE job ladder. We were still, being looked at for, how many design docs did you write? Like, what did you influence? And I was like, I kind of want to do more of those, SLO videos, right? People still literally stop me in the street and are like, are you Liz from the SRE videos? And I'm like, yes, I am. Right. So I realized that was kind of the most meaningful impact that I could have to shift the industry. So kind of, zooming out from I'm working on this individual SRE team to I'm working with this collection of a dozen different customers to I'm influencing hundreds or thousands of SRE teams across the world with, more diffusely, but kind of setting the direction of what does SRE mean? How do we achieve it?
I thought the same thing too. I have thought the same thing about developer advocacy. There's no other way to have such an impact across the globe. It's awesome.
Right, we think so much about, how do we avoid toil? How do we broaden our impact? And this is kind of one logical way of thinking about how do you scale out your impact.
So I'm curious about developer advocacy. We've got the term developer on it. We could call it reliability advocacy, whatever it is. And I'm curious about what role it plays in the SRE and observability space. And I thought maybe there's two angles that I thought about. The first one is for an organization. What's the value proposition to an organization for having developer advocates in their company?
I think way more organizations should have developer advocates than currently do. This is something that we leaned into early on at Honeycomb, right? The joke is that Charity, CTO of Honeycomb, co-founder, Charity was our first DevRel, whether she knew it or not, right? I think that there is this huge opportunity from interfacing with the market, right? Of having engineers who understand the technology, work hand in hand with customers and prospective customers to understand what the market wants and needs, right? It shortens your feedback loop, right? When we think about what DevOps is about, even if not SRE quite as it was originally conceived, right? DevOps is an implementation of Agile for operations, right? How do we shift workload left, right? So in that sense, one other way of shifting left is by making sure that customer requirements get baked in earlier on, and that we're kind of continuously testing that against what the market wants. So I think that's one angle, is that it enables you to build the right product rather than building the wrong thing and having to iterate afterwards. The other facet to, so that's kind of the SRE developer advocate as product manager facet. But when we're talking specifically about the world of SRE, I don't think you have to be selling a developer product externally to benefit from having developer advocates. If you are starting a internal platform team that has, SREs on it, that has tools developers on it, you really, really, really should strongly consider having a developer advocate on that team, a product manager on that team, a user experience researcher on that team. Because if what you're building as a platform for your own internal organization is not fit for purpose, people are going to shadow IT, right? People are going to bypass all of these nice things that you've built for your platform because it's not meeting their needs, right? So I think that's a really crucial thing where we have to help align whatever it is we're building, whether it be internal facing or external facing, with what the consumers are going to want.
As a developer advocate, how do you get feedback? Because that's something I've been struggling with. You put an idea out there. Do you just is it sort of qualitative? Is it about conversations that you've had and taking notes? Are you getting data like from using surveys and polls? So how do you actually get feedback about the ideas you're putting out there or the product?
It's definitely much more qualitative than quantitative. Certainly, there would be quantitative metrics that we need to check off just for the sake of justifying our headcount, right? So I think if there is some kind of resource like your slides that you want to register gate or otherwise, like, type in your email and then I'll email you a copy of the slides or whatever, right? That helps ensure that you are contributing value to the marketing organization. They can see that there's this clear connection between your speaking, people are interested in what you have to say, and they can get added to the company's address book. So I think that's one angle for sure. But I think in terms of actually deeply collecting that user feedback, it's about the whole conversations. That's why I said we're here to start conversations, right? We're not here to talk at people. So when you start that conversation, people will argue with you, right? If they passionately disagree with something that you said, right? Like, you will hear about it very loudly, right? You'll have people who agree with you but are not sure how to implement it in their organizations, who will then come up and ask you, like, I tried doing this, it didn't work. Like, what would you recommend? And if you're very, very lucky, people might want to chat with you offline after the conference, right? Instead of a 5-minute conversation right after your talk, you'll get the opportunity to spend half an hour with them, back at our desks, screen sharing rather than hunched over a laptop, just kind of really working through what do these challenges mean in this user's environment. If they're an existing customer, like, what are they encountering? If they're not an existing customer, how could we potentially help? Which kind of really starts by understanding what's the context, what are they working with? And those are things that you're not going to be able to get, right? If you are kind of cold reaching out to people and saying, can I look at your workflow, right? Most people are going to ignore you and be like, no. But if it's someone who has seen your talk, is curious for your feedback, right? They're going to share information with you and you're going to share your insights with them, right? So that kind of gives you a lot more grounding in actual experiences. Not to say that user experience research doesn't have a role, but I think by definition, user experience research tends to do a broader, more shallow sample of the market, right? Offering somebody a $50 gift card for an hour of their time or something, right? Like, there's a lot of value in that, but I think you're not able to go as in-depth with that. And also, you might not necessarily be able to capture the broader, like, here are the strategic pieces of how organizations are thinking about this problem. It might instead be like, how are people thinking about this specific feature that we're considering releasing, or the user affordances of it, or so forth.
There is definitely a challenge getting people to give up their time, because their time is precious. And I, when I was a practitioner and I would get asked, can we talk about this? Can we talk about this? I want to talk about product. I'd be like, no, I don't. I'm too busy. Go away. So I think that once you give something by putting yourself out there at a conference or writing a really well thought out piece of something, an article or a blog, I think people are more willing. Do you think people are more willing to have deeper conversations?
Absolutely, right? Because you've already given them something just from the material, and then they have a follow-up question they really want to answer. And they need to give you data to help you answer that question. And also that data is useful to you as someone who is collecting and collating that. And then, yes, that turns into the qualitative kind of summaries of, if someone's asking, like, hey, like, do we have any customers that do X or do Y? You can say, like, yes, I talked to a customer like that, like, a month ago, right? Again, as DevRels, we have to learn how to work the CRM, right? Like we have to work with sales, right? Like not necessarily because we're selling to people, but kind of recording those interactions so sales has that context and knows kind of what we talked with and who we talked with in an organization that they're trying to sell into.
Okay, I think there's heaps of value for organizations. That's clear to me. What's the value of like developer advocacy in the reliability space to the wider community? What does it offer?
I think that right, like we talk about developer advocacy, but it's really engineering advocacy in a variety of forms, right? Certainly, we've seen the folks at Noble 9 start calling themselves reliability advocates rather than developer advocates. No matter what you call it, right, there is an important role to help people who are working in a specific engineering-related job function be able to do their jobs better, right? To help equip them to suffer less alone, right? Often people are struggling with the same kind of patterns and themes, and they don't necessarily get the exposure to talk to many other people who are in that situation, or otherwise kind of distill down that wisdom. So certainly you can imagine that in a large organization like Google, you'll have the kind of production tech lead team that's responsible for, looking across all of Google, what are the challenges that SREs at Google are facing. What happens if you're working at a 100-person, 200-person startup, right? Who's looking out for, has this problem been solved before elsewhere in the industry? So I think that's kind of the connective tissue that we can kind of provide of, because we talk to so many people at so many different companies, we can give pointers, right? We can say like, hey, have you seen this work that this other person did? Encourage people to write about what they're doing. Some of whom will become DevRels and some of whom will just, continue being very, very communication focused, or at least people who share back with the community, but continue doing their day jobs. But I think, at the end of the day, you foster this kind of culture of sharing and this, Rolodex that kind of helps figure out who should be talking to who, what lessons should we be curating for SRECon, what should people know, especially as SRE gets democratized, right? A lot of organizations are no longer having SREs by job title necessarily, but saying we do want to have service level objectives, right? I think that's a great thing to not gatekeep, SLO must only be practiced by SREs, but how do you make sure that information is available? Right, to someone who might set an SLO up, maybe like once or twice a year, right, whose job it is not full-time to work on SLOs.
I think where developer advocacy is sort of global in reach, I guess my feeling is that internally, SREs within a company, there are related skills. To advocate within a company is just as important. And there's probably lots of people out there who are working in an SRE capacity, maybe sort of more senior leadership role where they are advocating internally and applying.
Yeah, right. Like if you are practicing kind of a consultative model of SRE, congratulations, you're kind of doing reliability advocacy within your own organization. You might not be doing it with your customers, you might not be doing it with peers at other companies, but you're definitely doing it in your own org. Yeah. Which is why I think the kind of customer reliability efforts, why I think, there's such a strong talent pipeline for DevRel at DevTools companies, drawing a lot from those SRE experiences, because we are very used to coaching teams, knowing that we are not meant to scale linearly with the number of client teams or services or TPS.
So I studied computer science, and then I went off and trained to be an actor. So I have this sort of artistic side. And one of the things I'm interested in is like storytelling and how to get people engaged. Do you think about that kind of thing when you're creating content or when you're going to speak at a conference? Do you think about the artistic side about people and how to engage them and to lead them on a journey?
One of the smartest things that I did in my first 2 weeks at Honeycomb, I was scheduled to give a talk about in my 9 days after starting at Honeycomb. And I commissioned an artist. Her name is Emily Griffin. She's at Emily with Curls on Twitter. I don't know where she's migrated since the great Twitter exodus, but I commissioned Emily Griffin to draw a bunch of custom artwork for the kind of core concepts that I knew I was going to need to start these conversations around reliability, SLOs, observability, collaboration, all these kind of key themes. And she did an amazing job. And I wound up commissioning, over the course of my first year, 3 talks worth of bespoke images from her. And kind of having that visual library of references of things to keep people kind of engaged with the story, kind of, picturing themselves, picturing their teams, picturing all of the analogies and metaphors I was using, it's come super in handy. Like, I would love to commission more work from her, but also like in some senses I don't need to, because like I kind of have this library, which I think is really awesome. So yeah, I definitely think a fair bit about, visually, how do we keep people engaged? From a story perspective, there are a number of tips that have been passed down to me over the ages, right? For instance, you don't start a talk by, and waste your first 30 to 60 most important seconds of captivating an audience with, hi, my name is Liz Fong-Jones and ... So it's, thinking about how do we, tell the hero's arc, right? How do we start with, a problem that someone's having, kind of how people picture themselves as the hero of the story. How does the story end, right? How do people resolve it, right? Like what makes people feel like they solved a real challenge at the end, right? Like those are elements that I certainly think about passively, if not actively. And then that turns into, what's the outline that I'm submitting? And then how do I translate that into the slides? Honestly, the mechanical translation of the slides is not the hard part. Sure, it's time consuming, but I think the hard part is formulating the right outline, telling the story in the right order, introducing the concepts in the right order so that people can follow along, so that people can have an understanding of where is this narrative arc going and where am I in that narrative arc.
Absolutely. I think that's the same thing when I'm creating a piece for an event. It's always what's the structure, what's the events, and I end up rearranging things completely different orders because that just makes more sense. And
I think in your world that's called storyboarding, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and being able to shift and change. Yeah, I on the visual thing. So I don't know if you've seen. I do like MS, like crappy MS Paint pictures. That's my thing, and it's just the reason they happen is because my wife's really good. She's really good at drawing, and she never had time to do stuff for me. So I was like, I'm annoyed. I'll just do it myself, and it's become this thing. It's like my brand now, and part of it is that because when you're drawing a really low pixel thing with a mouse, there's only so much you can draw. So you really have to simplify the essence of what you're drawing. Like I quite like that. I only had one it's a reasonably meaty question to finish with, which is that for this podcast, I meet a lot of different people around the world, and they're just in organizations, generally not product organizations. Often they're from, banks and insurance companies and work in retail and just all kinds of companies around the world. And lots of people are trying to implement SRE practices in some way or build an SRE practice within an organization. And they're sort of struggling and looking for guidance. And I was wondering, based on your experiences and conversations, do you have any sort of recommendations about how to get traction of SRE concepts in an organization where it's new and there might be an inertia with other kinds of processes and ways of working going on?
I think regardless of whether it's a methodology or, in our case, a set of tools, right? Honeycomb is a set of tools, but accompanied by a culture change, right? Like, you have to offer people something that is solving a problem that they have or helping them solve a problem they already have, but better than their existing thing, right? So I think, we can talk about SLOs until the cows come home, but I think the reality that we need to reinforce is that we need to take away some pain that people are having. Maybe it's that their pager is going off too often. Maybe it's that they can't necessarily debug things when the pager does go off, right? Like, either way, you have to kind of convince people that there is a problem and that the status quo is not working. And then you can kind of work backwards from there as to, okay, like, how do we persuade you there's a better way? How do we help you solve it? So otherwise, you wind up with people adopting, the latest and greatest management styles, right? Like, I've unfortunately seen a bunch of teams where they'll say, we have a DevOps team and a testing team and an SRE team and we have a change management team. And it's like, what the hell are you guys doing? Right? Frankly, what the hell are you guys doing? Right? Yeah. And I think that comes from not having this kind of single vision of, this is where we'd like to get to. These are the milestones that we'd like to achieve along the way. How do we structure and orient our teams and our practices in order to achieve that? So, it might be fine, right, to have a DevOps team, right? Like, as long as you're clear on what the charter is, right? Like, if the goal is we want to ship more quickly and to have reproducible builds, that's not the DevOps team, right? That's the builds and integration team, right? Which is one piece of the platform team, right? Now that suddenly makes sense, right? You've now delineated what problem is that team solving, how do we know if they're successful, and how do they interface with all of these other teams? So I think when we're talking about SRE, I think that comes down to, if our mission is to measure and improve reliability, we need to persuade people your reliability statistics are not accurate. You are continuously in pain, and you are kind of toiling away at trying to solve things that aren't necessarily moving the reliability needle, right? Like those are some aspects or angles that you might want to take when going to an organization that's in pain. But listen first, right? Not that pain is not necessarily universally applicable across all organizations. It is something that, right, from having worked with a number of these customers over the past 5 years now, right? Like I can say, I've seen this, right? I know that this is a common thread that I can pull out of, dozens of different large customers.
Another thing that's come to my mind is in my previous role in a large insurance company, that thinking about SRE like by the book was so far away from where the company was that it was almost unhelpful to mention the word SRE at all. And I almost thought that it was more important just to say, how can we design, implement and operate software, reliable software more effectively, and just think about that. And also think about the toil aspect. How can we make our ops teams' lives better? And
right, exactly. Right, like SRE is a set of tools. You don't have to use all of the tools.
Yeah, the example for us was SLOs. Like we really tried to get SLOs to work, but then like, why are we doing this? What are we actually trying to achieve with this? And we realized, you know what? The best thing right now would just be to improve observability, because we can't even measure any of these things because you don't have the right observability about what's going on in production.
Yeah. Right. If the number's red, great. What am I doing about it? I don't know.
Thank you so much, Liz, for coming on the show. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I know there's a lot of people out there who probably have heard the words DevRel, Developer Advocate, but didn't really know what it's about. And I think it's a really important part of every engineering community, including SRE. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and let me know if I can be some kind of a trusted partner to you.
Thank you. That sounds awesome. And everyone else out there, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week on Slight Reliability.